listen to anything I tell you!
In the quiet village of Oluwaro, where the wind always carried distant echoes of gossip, and the sun rose slowly over red earth and tall trees, there lived a woman named Ireti. People in the village whispered about her more than they greeted her. They said she was too closed, too distant, too unwilling to help, but no one truly understood why she lived that way. They saw the locked doors, the iron chains around her food chest, and the way she guarded her small home like a bird protecting a nest that no one else wanted. What they didn't see was the part of her past that shaped her into the woman she became. Ireti had once been a cheerful, bright-eyed girl who believed everyone was good. She shared the little she had, laughed freely, and never believed harm existed in the human heart. But life dealt her a blow that cracked that innocence forever. When she was 13, her mother fell sick so suddenly that no one was prepared. People made promises. They said they would help. They said they would bring herbs, and they said they would support the little girl once her mother was gone. But when the moment came when her mother took her final breath, the promises faded like smoke in the wind. People vanished. The help never came, and hunger became the first teacher she feared. One afternoon, as she tried to make Gary from cassava someone had gifted her mother before the sickness, an older woman snatched the bowl from her hands and hissed that she was young and strong and would survive even if she starved a little. That day, something hardened inside Ireti. She learned that if she wanted anything in this world, she would have to keep it safe, hide it, and never trust anyone to care about her well-being as much as she cared about theirs. She carried that lesson into adulthood, building invisible walls around herself, walls that grew higher with every disappointment she faced. Over the years, she became what the village called stingy, although she never saw herself that way. She saw herself as someone who had learned not to depend on anyone. She would walk past neighbors carrying heavy water pots without offering help. She would eat inside her darkened home, making sure no aroma escaped that might attract a knocking neighbor. Her windows stayed closed, her door stayed bolted, and her life remained small but safe. She sold firewood for a living and hid the money inside sealed clay pots beneath her bed. She bought bags of rice she didn't need, stacked yams she may never eat, and gathered everything she thought life might use to punish her with later. People in the village mocked her. Strangers laughed behind her back. Some children imitated her tight, suspicious expression when she walked by. But none of that mattered to Ireti. What mattered was that she would never again feel the kind of helpless hunger she felt as a child. She believed she was protecting herself, but what she didn't notice was how loneliness slowly wrapped itself around her like thick vines, suffocating parts of her she didn't even realize were dying. Oluwaro village, unlike Ireti, was a place of open hands. When someone harvested yams, they shared. When someone cooked soup, neighbors tasted it. When someone faced trouble, the entire village responded. Everyone looked out for one another, everyone except Ireti, and the village never forgot that. But then one Harmattan morning, everything changed. Smoke rose from the far end of the village where Mamate lived. Her old fragile hut had caught fire, and the flames spread with frightening speed. People screamed. Children cried. Men rushed with pails of water. Women shouted warnings. In the chaos, the entire village ran to help. Everyone was fighting the fire together, desperate to save Mamate's home. Everyone except Ireti. She stood at her door, watching through a narrow gap, then quietly closed it. She told herself the fire was not her concern. She told herself she was not strong enough to help. She told herself people had never been there for her, so she owed them nothing. And yet, as she lay on her mat later that night, the memory of her late mother's tired voice echoed in her mind.
You never listen to anything I tell you!
Telling her to help people whenever she had the chance. Ireti pressed a pillow over her ears and tried to sleep, but sleep refused to come. By the next morning, the news had spread through every corner of Oluwaro. Mamate had lost everything. Her food, her clothes, her calabashes, her roof, even her firewood. The whole village came together to support her. Someone brought water. Someone brought Gary. Someone gifted her a wrapper. And even those who had little still found something to give. Everyone gave, except Ireti. People noticed. Their whispers grew sharper. Their stares became colder. Their greetings became shorter. Ireti tried to ignore it, as she had ignored everything else in life. But something inside her felt unsettled, as if her soul was shifting uncomfortably in its own skin. Then one night, long after the moon hid behind heavy clouds, a knock came at Ireti's door. It was soft at first, so soft she thought she imagined it. Then it came again, slow and weak. Fear gripped her immediately. She stood still, listening to the quiet night, her heart pounding. The knock came a third time, barely there, like a plea spoken through trembling lips. She walked slowly to the door and asked sharply who was there. A small, fragile voice responded, just one word at first. Please. Then after a moment, water. The voice sounded tired, thin, maybe even sick. It was the voice of a young girl. Ireti froze. Her instincts screamed at her to send the person away. Her fear whispered that opening her door for anyone would lead to never-ending trouble. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She told herself the girl would be fine. She told herself someone else would help. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. The knocking stopped. The night grew quiet again. Ireti returned to her bed, but sleep avoided her like a stranger who feared her reputation. Each time she closed her eyes, she imagined the weak voice outside her door. She imagined the thirst in it, the desperation. She tossed and turned. She muttered to herself. She cursed the interruption. But still, she did not open the door. When dawn arrived, she finally gathered the courage to check outside. She opened her door just enough to look out, and what she saw weakened her knees. A small girl, no older than 12, was curled up near her doorstep. Her body was trembling, her lips cracked, her tiny hands gripping the earth as if holding onto life itself. She wasn't dead, but she was barely alive. Ireti's breath caught in her throat. The sight hit her with a force she didn't expect. Something deep within her cracked, something old and hardened. The girl whispered faintly, "I was just thirsty." Her voice was barely a sound. It was a memory of a voice, something fading. In that moment, Ireti felt a pain she hadn't felt in years. Not physical pain, but a memory of vulnerability. A memory of her younger self knocking on doors that never opened. Without thinking, she lifted the girl into her arms, slowly, carefully, awkwardly, as though she didn't remember how to hold another human being. The girl's body felt weightless, frighteningly light. She took her inside, gave her water, fed her small spoonfuls of food, and watched her sleep. And as the girl slept, Ireti found herself sitting beside her, unable to look away. She didn't know the girl's name, where she came from, or why she had ended up at her door. But for the first time in many years, Ireti didn't feel completely alone. The silence in her house had always felt safe before, but now it felt different. It felt like something might be changing, slowly, quietly, in ways she wasn't prepared for. And that was only the beginning of the storm that would soon come into her life. As the sun climbed slowly into the pale morning sky, the girl on Ireti's mat began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered. Her fingers twitched slightly, and she let out a soft breath, as if awakening from a faraway dream. Ireti watched her closely, unsure of what to expect. When the girl finally opened her eyes, they were wide and frightened, as if she didn't know where she was or how she got there. She tried to sit up quickly, but her weak body betrayed her, and she slumped back onto the mat. "Take it easy," Ireti said, her voice sounding unfamiliar to even herself. It had been so long since she had spoken gently to anyone. The girl blinked up at her, confused, then whispered, "Thank you." The words were so soft that Ireti almost didn't hear them. She felt something warm and uncomfortable in her chest, something she quickly pushed down before it became too noticeable. "You were outside my door," Ireti said stiffly. "You should have been home. Why were you wandering at night?" The girl lowered her eyes and said nothing for a while. Then she whispered, "I didn't have anywhere to go." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked away, ashamed. That small confession unsettled Ireti. She didn't know how to respond to it. She didn't know how to handle someone who was as lost as she once had been. She stood up abruptly and walked to her water pot, filling a small gourd cup and handing it to the girl. "Drink," she said. The girl drank slowly, her hands trembling a little. After she finished, she lay back down, exhausted, as though even drinking water had drained what little strength she had left. Ireti sighed and moved to prepare something simple for her to eat, a tiny portion of rice.
I should protect this girl that chose me.
Cooked soft, with a bit of palm oil. It wasn't much, but it was something. When she returned to the mat, the girl opened her eyes again. "What is your name?" Ireti asked. The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Io." It was a name that meant joy, but Io's face carried none of that meaning. She looked worn out, bruised by life, too young to know such emptiness. Ireti nodded and said nothing more. She placed the small bowl of food beside her and walked away, giving the girl space to eat in silence. As Io ate slowly, carefully, Ireti pretended to busy herself by rearranging her clay pots and sweeping a corner of the room that didn't need sweeping. But she kept glancing at the girl, trying to understand her, trying to figure out where she came from and why fate had brought her to her door of all places. Every time their eyes accidentally met, Io quickly looked down, as if afraid she would be sent away if she stared too long. When she finished eating, Io sat quietly, her hands on her lap, her shoulders slightly hunched. Finally, she gathered the courage to speak. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to trouble you." The apology tugged at something inside Ireti. She didn't like the feeling. She didn't like how the girl's vulnerability reminded her too much of her younger self, alone and frightened, hoping someone would open their door. "You should rest," Ireti muttered, avoiding eye contact. "You still look weak." Io nodded, lying back down, her breathing soft and steady. As she drifted off to sleep, Ireti found herself staring again. She didn't know what to do with this unexpected presence in her home. She didn't know how to balance the fear she felt with the responsibility that seemed to have fallen into her hands. Throughout the day, villagers passed by her house as usual, some glancing at her closed door, wondering why she hadn't stepped out to sell firewood at her usual time. She didn't open the door for anyone. She didn't want anyone to see the girl. She didn't want questions. She didn't want gossip. And she didn't want anyone assuming she had suddenly become generous. But deep inside, she knew that her life had already shifted. Something had entered her home, not just a child, but a change she had no control over, and changes frightened her more than anything else. As the evening approached, Aya woke again. Her strength had returned a little, enough for her to sit upright. She looked around the small room, absorbing the details, the clay pots stacked in quiet corners, the old woven mat, the soot-darkened cooking stones. It wasn't much, but it was more than whatever she had before she collapsed at the door. "Where is your family?" Ireti asked suddenly. Io's hands immediately tightened on her dress. Her eyes filled with something raw, fear, pain, memories she didn't want to revisit. I don't have anyone," she said softly. "I was staying with a distant relative, but they told me I couldn't stay anymore." She swallowed hard, her voice wobbling. "I was walking, trying to find anywhere safe. I stopped at your door because I saw a little light inside. The word struck Ireti like a blow. So the girl had knocked because she saw hope. Hope coming from the most closed-off house in the entire village. Irony wrapped itself around the moment, leaving Ireti unsteady. She turned away, struggling to hide the emotion rising in her chest. "You can stay until you're strong enough to move," she said firmly. "After that, you must figure out where to go." Io nodded without complaint. She was grateful for even that small mercy. The night passed quietly, but something about the presence of another breathing body in the room shifted the air. Ireti found herself listening to the soft rhythm of Ayo's breathing, a sound that made her house feel less empty. She didn't sleep deeply. Her mind wrestled with memories and fears she had buried for years. By morning, Aya was stronger, able to stand and walk around slowly. She helped sweep the room without being asked. She folded the mats neatly. She even stepped outside to fetch a small amount of water when she saw the pot was low. Each small action surprised Ireti, who had grown used to doing everything alone. When neighbors saw a small figure outside her house, whispers spread quickly. Children stopped to stare. Women exchanged suspicious glances. Men paused on their way to the farm, murmuring under their breath. What was a young girl doing at Ireti's home? Had she taken in someone? Was the stingy woman changing? By afternoon, rumors had traveled across the village. Some said the girl was her long-lost daughter. Others claimed the girl was a thief Ireti had caught. A few believed the girl had bewitched her. The stories grew wild and tangled, and none of them were true. But gossip traveled faster than truth in Oluwaro. When Ireti stepped outside later that day, conversation stopped abruptly. Eyes followed her every move. But instead of confronting anyone or offering an explanation, she simply ignored them, as she had always done. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. And yet beneath her calm exterior, she felt uneasy. Io stayed close to her, afraid of the stares and whispers. She tugged gently at the edge of Ireti's wrapper and whispered, "Are they angry at me?" Ireti looked down at her, and for the first time in many years, her voice softened without force. "No," she said, "they're just surprised. People fear what they don't understand." Io nodded, though she didn't fully understand those words. What she understood was that Ireti, this woman with the locked doors and guarded heart, was protecting her in her own strange, stiff way. That night, as they shared a quiet meal, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile thread connecting two lonely souls who had been wounded by life in different ways. It was not friendship yet, and certainly not family, but it was something, a beginning. And beginnings have a way of growing into things nobody expects. A storm was coming for Ireti, a storm that would take everything she had spent years holding on to. But neither she nor Ayo knew that yet. They simply sat in the warm glow of the lantern, eating silently, unaware that the first cracks in Ireti's old life had already begun to spread.
The next few days settled into a quiet rhythm neither of them expected. Io would wake early, sweep the compound, and help tidy the little things she could manage. She was still thin, still fragile in a way that made Ireti constantly glance at her to be sure she hadn't fainted again. But Io moved with determination, as if trying to prove she was worth the space she occupied. Ireti pretended not to notice. She pretended she didn't care. She pretended Io's soft presence didn't change the way her home felt. But the truth quietly worked its way under her skin. The house no longer echoed with the sharp silence that had once comforted her. Instead, it carried the soft hum of life, gentle footsteps, the sound of water being poured, the soft whisk of a broom, the quiet hum Io made when she concentrated on something. Even the sunlight seemed different, as if it entered the house more willingly now that someone else was there to receive it. But the outside world was not as peaceful. The village's whispers grew louder every day. Old women paused outside Ireti's door longer than usual, pretending to adjust their wrappers. Young men walking to the river slowed their steps, curious. Children whispered behind their hands, throwing quick glances toward the house. Everyone wanted to know who the girl was and what she meant for the woman who never welcomed strangers. One afternoon, as Ireti returned from the bush with a small bundle of firewood on her head, she noticed two women standing near her house, talking in hushed voices. When they noticed her, they stopped whispering, but their eyes stayed sharp and their expressions heavy with judgment. Ireti walked past them without a word, but Io, who had been waiting at the door, could sense the tension. She stepped back slightly, hiding behind the doorway as Ireti entered. "They don't like me," Io whispered once the door had closed. Her voice trembled just enough for Ireti to notice. Ireti dropped the firewood beside the cooking stones and dusted her hands. "It's not you they have a problem with," she replied. "It's me." She said it plainly, as if stating the weather. Io stared at her for a moment, unsure how to respond. After a long silence, she asked quietly, "But why? Did you do something bad?" Ireti paused, the question striking deeper than she expected. She wasn't sure how to answer. She didn't know whether her behavior over the years counted as bad or simply necessary. She didn't know whether protecting herself meant harming others. She didn't know whether her loneliness was punishment or choice. So she simply said, "People don't like what they don't understand." And that was all. Io nodded, though confusion still lingered in her eyes. As days turned into a slow, uneasy week, something else began to shift. Neighbors who once ignored Ireti now kept a closer watch on her home. Everyone pretended not to care, yet everyone wanted to know what was happening inside those walls. Some believed Io was a burden, others believed she would lead to trouble. A few even wondered if Io had been brought by spirits or curses, arriving at the door of the one woman who never shared. Rumors thickened like dust in the Harmattan air. One evening, as the sky dimmed into a soft orange, a woman named Asake stopped Ireti on her way back from the stream. Asake was known for her sharp tongue and sharper curiosity. She smiled too wide, the kind of smile that stretched but never reached the eyes. "Ireti," she called sweetly, placing a hand on her hip. "I hear you have a house guest." Ireti stiffened. "And what of it?" she asked, keeping her voice flat. "Oh, nothing," Asake said, waving her hand dramatically. "We are just surprised. You? Taking in someone? Feeding someone? Letting someone sleep under your roof? Ah, wonders shall never end in this village." A few other women nearby giggled, covering their mouths in that exaggerated way that pretended to be polite but wasn't. Io, who had been walking a few steps behind, lowered her head quickly, hiding her face from their eyes. Ireti felt heat rising in her chest, the old familiar anger she carried like a shield. She could have ignored Asake, she could have walked away. But something about the way the woman looked at Io, like she was an intruder, like she was worthless, made Ireti stop. "Yes," she said firmly, "she is staying with me." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Asake's eyebrows shot up. The other women exchanged shocked glances. But for once, Ireti didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She didn't care about their whispers. She grabbed Io's hand lightly, guiding her forward. Asake and her friends stared after them as if witnessing an omen. When they returned home, Io looked up at her with confused eyes. "Why did you defend me?" she asked softly. Ireti didn't answer at first. She busied herself with removing her slippers and dusting her wrapper. Then she said, almost reluctantly, "Because you are under my roof, and anyone under my roof is not for them to insult." Io nodded slowly. She understood more than she let on. "Thank you," she whispered. The words sat heavily but warmly in the room, and Ireti found herself unable to push the gratitude away like she normally did. Instead, she simply nodded back. As night crept in and the lantern glow filled the small room, Io finally drifted into peaceful sleep. But Ireti stayed awake for some time, sitting on her mat, listening to the quiet of the house. Something was different now. The silence didn't feel empty the way it used to. It felt full. Full of emotions she had buried, full of thoughts she didn't want to think, full of responsibilities she didn't ask for but somehow accepted. Outside, the village wind rustled the leaves gently, unaware of the slow transformation taking place behind the locked door. A transformation that neither Ireti nor Io could fully understand yet. A transformation that would soon shake everything Ireti had spent her life protecting, because life, fate, and stories have a way of moving forward even when we try to stand still. And soon, forces much larger than the whispers of neighbors would come knocking, forces that would push Ireti into the greatest test of her life. The test that would show whether she would cling to her old ways, or lose everything she ever held on to.
The days that followed brought a tension that lingered in the air like a storm that refused to break. Ireti felt it each time she stepped outside her house, each time she passed by neighbors who no longer hid their curiosity or judgment. Ao felt it too, even though she tried to remain invisible, moving quietly, speaking softly, staying close to the walls as if hoping she could blend into them. The village had noticed her presence, and once a village noticed something, it rarely let go. One afternoon, while Ireti was sorting firewood in her compound, she overheard two men talking nearby. They did not lower their voices when they passed. They did not pretend she wasn't listening. "I heard the girl came from nowhere," one of them said. "No family, no history." The other responded with a scoff. "That's how trouble enters a house. From nowhere." Their laughter followed them as they walked away. Ireti clenched her jaw and continued stacking the firewood, her hands moving faster than usual. She had lived with judgment all her life, but this time it felt heavier because it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Ao, and whether she liked it or not, Ao had become part of her life. That evening, as they sat together eating quietly, Ao hesitated before speaking. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked suddenly. The question caught Ireti off guard. She looked up, surprised. Ao's eyes were filled with worry, not fear for herself alone, but concern for Ireti. "I don't want people to hate you because of me," she added softly. Ireti stared at her for a long moment. For years, she had lived without caring whether people liked her or not. But now, hearing that the girl was willing to leave just to protect her stirred something deep inside her chest. "You're not the reason they talk," Ireti said finally. "They talked long before you arrived." She paused, then added, "You will stay. At least until we figure things out." Ao nodded, relief washing over her face, though uncertainty still lingered. That night, she slept close to the wall, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. Ireti watched her for a while before lying down, wondering when she had started caring so much. The answer became clear sooner than she expected. A few days later, a heavy rainstorm rolled into Oluwara without warning. The clouds darkened early in the afternoon, swallowing the sun and turning the sky a deep, angry gray. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the ground beneath their feet. People rushed to secure their roofs and pull children indoors. Ireti had just finished tying down the small awning outside her house when the rain began to pour, fast and unforgiving. Within minutes, water flooded the narrow paths of the village. The stream near the far end overflowed, pushing muddy water toward nearby homes. Shouts filled the air as people scrambled to protect what little they had. Ireti stood in her doorway, watching the chaos unfold. Her heart pounded. She knew floods like this. She had seen what they could do. Ao tugged at her wrapper. "Auntie, people are shouting," she said, fear creeping into her voice. "I can hear them," Ireti replied, already moving. She quickly gathered her valuables, lifting the clay pots where she hid her money, dragging sacks of food toward higher ground inside the house. She had done this many times before. She knew how to protect what was hers. But then a scream pierced the rain. "Help! Please help!" It came from the direction of Mama Tay's rebuilt hut. Without thinking, Ireti rushed outside, the rain soaking her wrapper instantly. She saw Mama Tay struggling to lift a small wooden chest out of the rising water. Her thin arms shook with the effort. The water had already reached her knees. For a moment, Ireti hesitated. Fear wrapped around her heart. If she stepped into that water, she could lose something. She could get hurt. She could risk what little safety she had. Then she felt Ao's hand grip hers tightly. Please, Ao whispered. She can't do it alone. The rain blurred Ireti's vision, but she could still see Mama Tay's desperation clearly. It looked too familiar, too much like her own past. With a sharp breath, Ireti stepped into the water. It was cold, biting into her skin, pulling at her legs. She waded toward Mama Tay and grabbed the chest from her trembling hands. Together, they struggled to higher ground, panting, soaked, exhausted. Mama Tay looked at Ireti in disbelief. You came, she said, her voice shaking. You actually came. Ireti didn't respond. She was too busy catching her breath, too busy feeling something shift inside her. The water continued to rise, and more screams echoed through the village. Without waiting for thanks, she turned back, helping others move small belongings, guiding children to safety, lending her strength wherever she could. It didn't take long for the villagers to notice. Eyes widened. Whispers turned into shocked murmurs. People stared as Ireti, the woman who never helped anyone, stood knee-deep in muddy water, lifting, pulling, pushing, helping. Ao stayed close, holding onto her wrapper, watching everything with wide eyes. She had never seen Ireti like this. She had never imagined such a transformation. By the time the rain slowed and the floodwaters began to retreat, Ireti was drenched, exhausted, and shivering. But something else burned inside her now, a strange mix of fear, relief, and something dangerously close to pride. The village gathered afterward, bruised but alive. Homes were damaged, belongings lost, but no lives were taken. People talked quietly, sharing stories of the storm, counting losses, offering comfort. And for the first time in years, people spoke of Ireti without bitterness. She helped, someone said. She didn't run away, another added. She carried Mama Tay's chest herself. Ireti overheard the murmurs as she walked back home with Ao. She felt exposed, uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being seen this way. She wasn't sure she liked it. Inside her house, she changed into dry clothes and sat heavily on her mat. Ao stood in front of her, eyes shining. You saved them, she said softly. Ireti shook her head. I didn't save anyone. I just did what was necessary. Ao smiled, small but sincere. That's what saving is, she said. The words lingered in the air long after the rain stopped. But change, once started, does not stop quietly. And while Ireti had taken her first step toward opening her heart, fate was already preparing the next blow. A blow that would not come from rain or whispers, but from the very thing she had spent her life clinging to. Her possessions, her stored wealth, her carefully guarded sense of security. And when that blow came, it would leave her with nothing to hide behind. The morning after the storm arrived quietly, almost deceptively calm. The sun rose as if nothing had happened, shining gently on broken fences, soaked mats laid out to dry, and muddy footprints scattered across the village paths. People moved slowly, tired but thankful to be alive. Losses were counted in silence. Pots were retrieved from puddles. Clothes were wrung and spread across bushes. Life, as always, was trying to return to normal. Inside her house, Ireti sat on her mat, staring at her clay pots lined up neatly against the wall. The storm had not reached her home. Her food was safe. Her money was intact. Her locks had held. That knowledge should have comforted her, but instead, it left her unsettled. She kept thinking about the look in Mama Tay's eyes when she had lifted that wooden chest. She kept hearing Ao's voice calling her brave. She didn't feel brave. She felt exposed. Ao moved quietly around the room, careful not to disturb her thoughts. She prepared a simple meal and set it down in front of Ireti before sitting a short distance away. They ate in silence. The silence was different now. It was no longer sharp or cold. It was heavy, thoughtful, filled with things unsaid. Later that day, a group of women passed by Ireti's house on their way to check on another neighbor. One of them paused and called out, "Thank you for yesterday." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Ireti nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond. Gratitude made her uncomfortable. It felt like standing in the open without armor. As the day stretched on, something else began to trouble her. A quiet unease settled in her chest, a sense that things were shifting too quickly. Change, once welcomed, now felt dangerous. She had lived her life believing that safety came from holding tightly to what was hers. Now, after one storm and one act of kindness, people were looking at her differently. Expecting things, watching her. That night, she double-checked her locks. She counted her pots. She moved her food sacks closer to the wall. Old habits returned easily, wrapping around her like familiar cloth. Ao noticed the tension but said nothing. She curled up on her mat and slept, trusting the walls that had protected her the night before. Sometime in the deep of the night, when the village was quiet and even the insects seemed to pause, a sound crept into Ireti's sleep. At first, it was faint. A soft rustle, then another. Her eyes snapped open. Her heart began to race. She sat up slowly, straining to listen. The sound came again, a scraping noise, deliberate and careful, coming from the back of her house. Fear flooded her veins instantly. Thieves. Her first instinct was to move quietly, to protect her things, to grab whatever she could hide. She glanced at Ao, still asleep, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Ireti stood, her movements slow and tense. She reached for a heavy stick she kept near the door and tiptoed toward the sound. The scraping grew louder. Something was being forced. Her chest tightened. Years of fear, suspicion, and guarding rose up inside her all at once. She flung the door open suddenly and shouted. Two figures froze in the moonlight. They were young men, village boys, not strangers. One dropped a sack immediately. The other tried to run, but slipped in the mud and fell. The noise woke neighbors, and within moments, shouts erupted from nearby houses. Lanterns flared to life. Footsteps pounded the ground. The thieves were caught. As villagers gathered, anger bubbled quickly. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Someone shouted that the boys should be beaten. Someone else demanded they be tied up. Ireti stood there, breathing hard, staring at the sack that had been dropped. She knew what was inside without opening. Her food, her carefully stored food. Ao stepped out behind her, trembling. "What's happening?" she whispered. Ireti didn't answer. She stared at the boys, their heads lowered, fear written clearly on their faces. They were thin, too thin. One of them had mud on his knees from falling. The other's hands shook violently. "They were stealing from you," someone said loudly. "From you of all people. After you helped yesterday." The words hit her like stones. "Stealing from you. After you helped." The irony tasted bitter in her mouth. One of the boys looked up suddenly, desperation spilling out of him. "We were hungry," he said, his voice cracking. "Our food was washed away. We didn't know where else to go." The crowd erupted again. Some scoffed. Others argued. Hunger was not an excuse, they said. Stealing was stealing. Ireti felt her vision blur slightly. Hunger. The word echoed in her mind, dragging her back years, back to a younger version of herself standing empty-handed, ignored, dismissed. Her hands tightened around the stick. This was the moment that would decide everything. If she followed her old ways, she would demand punishment. She would protect her possessions. She would prove she was still the same Ireti everyone feared and expected nothing from. If she chose differently, her chest felt like it was splitting open. Slowly, she lowered the stick. "They will not be beaten," she said. The crowd fell silent. She stepped forward and picked up the sack. She opened it and looked inside. Some of her food was gone, but not all. She closed the sack again and turned to the boys. "Go," she said quietly. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone protested. Someone shouted that she was encouraging theft. Someone else shook their head in disbelief. Ireti didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply walked back into her house and returned moments later with a small bundle of food. She placed it on the ground in front of the boys. "Take this," she said. "And don't come back here again." The boys stared at her, stunned. Then one of them dropped to his knees, crying openly. "Thank you," he whispered again and again. They took the food and ran. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring, confused, unsettled. Ao stood beside Ireti, eyes wide. You gave them food, she said softly. Ireti nodded, though her hands were shaking. I know what hunger does to people, she replied. That night, after everyone had gone and the village returned to uneasy sleep, Ireti sat alone, staring at the empty space where some of her food sacks used to be. She expected panic. She expected regret. She expected fear. But instead, she felt something else. Loss. And relief. Because for the first time, she had lost something she had always believed defined her, and the world had not ended. She didn't know it yet, but that night marked the beginning of the unraveling. Not just of her possessions, but of the life she had built around them. And soon, much more would be taken from her. Not by thieves, not by storms, but by fate itself. The days after the theft passed in a strange blur. Ireti woke each morning expecting to feel panic clawing at her chest, expecting fear to sit heavy in her stomach the way it always had when she imagined losing what she owned. But the panic never fully came. Instead, there was a quiet restlessness, a feeling like standing on unfamiliar ground. She had always believed that giving even a little would leave her empty. Now she had given more than she ever thought she could, and yet she was still standing. Ao noticed the change before anyone else did. Ireti was quieter, more thoughtful. She spent less time counting her possessions and more time staring into space. Sometimes she would reach for a pot or a sack and then stop, as if remembering something important she had not yet understood. The village, however, did not move at the same slow pace as her thoughts. People talked. They always did, but the tone had shifted again. This time, it wasn't sharp or mocking. It was confused, curious, even cautious. Some people said Ireti had finally changed. Others said it was a trick, that she would soon return to her old ways. A few claimed the girl living with her had softened her heart, while others whispered that Ireti had been cursed by kindness and would soon pay for it. Ireti ignored them all. What she could not ignore was the slow drain on her stores. Feeding 2 people instead of 1 changed things more than she expected. The sacks of rice emptied faster. The yams shrank in number. The coins she once stacked so carefully began to disappear, one by one, as she bought extra food, soap, and medicine for Ao, who still struggled with weakness from time to time. Each time she spent money, her heart flinched. Each time she reached into a pot and felt fewer coins than before, her breath caught. Old fears stirred, whispering that she was being foolish, that she was opening herself to suffering again. At night, she lay awake, listening to Ao's breathing, wondering if she was doing the right thing. Wondering if kindness was simply another way to starve slowly. One evening, Ao returned from fetching water with a troubled look on her face. Someone spoke to me today, she said quietly as she set the pot down. Ireti looked up sharply. Who? One of the women near the stream, Ao replied. She asked why I stay with you. She said I should be careful, that you only help people when it benefits you. The words stung more than Ireti expected. She felt a familiar anger rise, sharp and protective. And what did you say? She asked. Ao hesitated. I told her you saved me. I told her you gave food to the boys who tried to steal from you. I told her you are not a bad person. Ireti swallowed hard. Praise made her uncomfortable. Defense made her uneasy. She had lived so long without either. People will always talk, she said finally. You don't owe anyone explanations. Ao nodded, but her eyes lingered on Ireti's face, searching for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or confirmation that she was truly safe. As the weeks passed, another problem crept quietly into Ireti's life. Fewer people came to buy her firewood. At first, she thought it was coincidence. Then she noticed patterns. People passed her by, choosing other sellers. Some avoided her eyes. Others smiled politely but kept walking. One day, she overheard 2 women whispering nearby. She has food, one said. She won't need money anymore. The other laughed. Let her share what she has. Ireti felt a chill run through her. The realization hit her slowly but painfully. People believed she was now obligated. That because she had helped once, because she had opened her door, she would continue to give without limit. The same people who once mocked her for being stingy were now watching to see how much more she would lose. That night, fear returned in full force. She sat alone, counting her remaining coins, her hands trembling. The numbers were smaller than she liked. Smaller than they should have been. She imagined a future where the pots were empty, where hunger returned, where promises failed again. Ao watched her quietly from across the room. After a long silence, she spoke. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. Ireti looked up, startled. She opened her mouth to deny it, to protect herself with pride, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded once. "Yes," she said, "I'm afraid." Ao stood and walked closer. "You're afraid of losing everything," she said gently. Ireti's throat tightened. "I already know what that feels like," she replied. "I promised myself I would never go back to that place." Ao sat beside her. "You're not the same person anymore," she said. "And you're not alone." The words hung between them, fragile and powerful. Ireti wanted to believe them. She truly did, but belief was harder than fear. Then, just when she thought she might find balance again, fate struck harder than it ever had before. It began with sickness. One morning, Ireti woke with a heavy weight in her chest. Her body felt weak, her head throbbed, and her limbs ached as though she had walked for days without rest. She tried to stand and nearly collapsed. Ao rushed to her side, panic flooding her face. "You're burning," Ao said, pressing a hand to her forehead. "You have fever." Ireti tried to wave her off, but her strength was gone. Within hours, she was too weak to leave her mat. Ao ran to fetch help, calling on neighbors despite her fear of them. By evening, an old herbalist arrived and examined Ireti with a grave expression. "She needs rest and medicine," the woman said. "And food. Good food." The words echoed painfully in Ireti's mind. Food, money, time, things she was running out of. As the fever worsened over the next days, Ireti drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by memories and dreams. She dreamed of locked doors, empty bowls, and hands reaching out to her from the dark. She dreamed of her mother calling her name, asking her why she was so afraid. Through it all, Ao stayed. She fed her, she cleaned her, she sold what little firewood remained to buy herbs. She even gave away one of her own wrappers to trade for medicine. When Ireti finally opened her eyes after days of sickness, the first thing she saw was Ao sleeping on the floor beside her mat, exhausted, thinner than before. Tears slipped silently from Ireti's eyes. In her weakness, in her illness, she finally understood the truth she had spent her life running from. Everything she had hoarded could disappear in a moment. But love, once given, could keep someone alive. And she was about to learn just how much everything else could be taken from her. When Ireti finally regained enough strength to sit up on her own, the world felt different. Her body was lighter, but her heart felt heavier. Illness had stripped her of control, forced her to depend on someone else, and in that helplessness, she had seen herself clearly for the first time. She saw the years she had spent guarding her possessions like a wounded animal. She saw how easily all of it could vanish. And she saw the quiet devotion of a child she had once been afraid to let inside her home. Ao noticed the change immediately. Ireti's eyes followed her movements now, softer, more thoughtful. She asked questions she had never asked before. Whether Ao had eaten, whether she was tired, whether she was in pain. These were small things, but to Ao, they meant everything. Yet outside their home, the village was shifting again. Word spread quickly that Ireti had been sick. Some people felt pity, others felt expectation, a few felt opportunity. When a person known for guarding her wealth fell ill, people began to wonder what she still had and what she might be willing to give away. It started with gentle knocks. One morning, a woman came asking for salt. Another day, a man asked for palm oil. A neighbor sent her child to ask for Gary. Each request came with polite words and smiling faces, but Ireti felt the pressure beneath them. She gave when she could, her hands shaking as she handed over small portions, fear and guilt fighting inside her chest. Each time she gave, the knocks came more frequently. Ao watched this quietly. She helped measure portions, helped explain when supplies were low, helped soothe Ireti's anxiety when the pots grew emptier. But even she could see where this was heading. One evening, as they sat together counting what remained, Ao spoke carefully. "You can't give to everyone," she said. "You'll disappear." The words hit Ireti hard. Disappear. That was the fear she had lived with all her life. "If I don't give," Ireti replied, they will say I have returned to who I was before. Ao shook her head gently. Being kind doesn't mean destroying yourself. Ireti didn't respond. She didn't know how to balance kindness with survival. She had never learned moderation, only extremes. Either she held everything or she gave until nothing remained. The breaking point came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, a group of villagers arrived at her door together. Not to ask politely, not to knock gently. They stood there, arms folded, faces serious. One of the men spoke. "We know you have food," he said. "Others lost everything in the storm. You should help more." The word should burned in her ears. "I have already helped," Ireti said quietly. Another woman scoffed. "You helped when it suited you. But hunger doesn't wait." The pressure closed in on her like a tightening rope. Fear, anger, old resentment, all of it surged at once. "I am not responsible for everyone," she said, her voice trembling. Murmurs spread through the group. Disappointment turned to irritation. Someone muttered that she was selfish again. Someone else said they knew she would never truly change. When the group finally left, Ireti collapsed onto her mat, shaking. Ao rushed to her side, holding her hands. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said firmly. But the damage was done. That night, someone broke into her storehouse. Not quietly, not carefully. They came in numbers. By the time Ireti woke to the sound of crashing wood and shouting, it was already too late. People were tearing through her remaining food, grabbing sacks, spilling grains onto the ground. She screamed, her voice cracking with disbelief and terror. Ao clung to her, crying. "Stop," Ireti shouted. "Please." But desperation had drowned out reason. Hunger had turned people into shadows of themselves. The villagers she had helped. The villagers who had judged her. They all blurred together in the chaos. When it was over, the storehouse stood empty. No rice, no yams, no dried fish, nothing. The villagers left in silence, shame heavy in the air. Ireti sat on the ground long after they were gone, staring at the empty space where her life's security had been stored. Her hands were numb. Her heart felt hollow. She had lost everything. Not slowly, not carefully, all at once. Ao knelt beside her, trembling. "We'll be okay," she whispered, though her voice was unsure. Ireti laughed then, not with joy, with disbelief, with grief, with the sound of a woman who had finally reached the bottom of her fear. She had spent her entire life protecting herself from loss, only to lose it all when she finally opened her heart. And yet, even in that emptiness, something unexpected stirred. Freedom. She didn't know it yet, but the loss of everything she owned was only the beginning of what she was about to gain. The days that followed the looting passed in a slow, painful haze. Ireti moved through them like a woman walking through smoke, seeing shapes but not fully understanding them. Her storehouse remained empty, the wooden shelves bare, the floor still scattered with broken grains she hadn't had the strength to sweep away. Each time she stepped inside, her chest tightened. That space had once held her sense of safety. Now it held nothing but silence. For the first time in her adult life, Ireti truly had nothing. No food stored away, no hidden coins, no protection. The realization was terrifying, but what frightened her more was how quiet her fear felt. It was there, yes, but it no longer screamed. It sat beside her like a tired companion. She had imagined this moment for years, feared it endlessly, and now that it had arrived, she found herself strangely calm. As if her heart had already cried all its tears before this moment came. Ao became her anchor. Each morning, Ao woke early and did what she could. She fetched water. She helped neighbors sweep in exchange for small portions of food. She learned quickly who was kind and who was not. She returned each day with whatever she could gather, sometimes a handful of rice, sometimes nothing at all. But she always returned with determination in her eyes. Ireti watched her quietly, shame and gratitude tangled together inside her chest. She had once believed kindness made you weak. Now she saw how strength could grow from it. Some villagers avoided her entirely after the looting, too ashamed to meet her eyes. Others whispered apologies when they passed. A few brought small offerings, a bowl of soup, a bundle of vegetables, a piece of dried fish. Not out of obligation, but out of guilt, or respect, or perhaps realization. Ireti accepted what was offered without pride or bitterness. She thanked them simply. She did not beg, she did not accuse, and that quiet dignity unsettled people more than anger ever could. One evening, as she sat outside watching the sun dip low, Mama Tay approached slowly. She held a small calabash of soup in her hands. Her movements were careful, as if she feared being turned away. "I heard what happened," Mama Tay said softly. "I'm sorry." Ireti looked up at her. For a moment, she saw not the woman she had once ignored during the fire, but a fragile elder who had survived loss more times than she could count. "It's done," Ireti replied. "There is nothing left to take." Mama Tay sighed and sat beside her. "Loss changes people," she said. "But it doesn't always destroy them." Ireti nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand that truth. That night, she lay on her mat beside Ao, staring at the ceiling. Hunger pressed at her stomach, but it wasn't unbearable. What hurt more was the memory of how tightly she had clung to things that could be taken so easily. She thought of her younger self, terrified and alone. She thought of the girl beside her now, breathing softly in her sleep. "I don't know how to live like this," Ireti whispered into the darkness. Ao stirred slightly. "You already are," she murmured, half asleep. In the days that followed, Ireti began to do something she had never done before. She asked for help, not loudly, not desperately, but honestly. She spoke to the village head about work. She offered to help on farms in exchange for food. She joined women at the river to wash clothes for a few coins. Her hands, once reserved only for guarding her possessions, now worked alongside others. The labor was hard, the days were long, but each evening, she returned home tired in a way that felt earned, not fearful. The village watched this transformation quietly. Some were impressed, some were confused, some were ashamed, but no one could deny that Ireti had changed. As weeks passed, small stability returned. Not wealth, not security in the way she once knew it, but community. People began to greet her again. Not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. She was no longer the woman with locked doors. She was the woman who had lost everything and kept going. One afternoon, as she worked beside other women at the river, one of them spoke hesitantly. "You're different now," she said. "You don't hold yourself the same way." Ireti paused, then nodded. "I used to think holding tightly was the only way to survive," she replied. "Now I know it was also how I was suffocating." The words surprised even her. Ao flourished during this time. She laughed more, she spoke more, she learned quickly and eagerly. The village children began to include her in their games. For the first time since she had arrived in Olawuro, she belonged. One evening, as they shared a simple meal, Ao looked up at Ireti with serious eyes. "You didn't lose everything," she said. Ireti smiled faintly. "I lost all the things I was afraid to lose." Ao shook her head. "You gained something better." Ireti looked at her then, really looked at her. At the child who had arrived at her door thirsty and weak. At the child who had stayed when everything else left. At the child who had taught her more than any hardship ever had. And in that moment, Ireti realized the truth. She had not lost everything. She had lost what was never meant to save her. And in its place, she had found something far more powerful. But the story was not yet finished. Because true change is tested not in loss alone, but in what we do when we are given a second chance. The second chance did not arrive as a sudden miracle. It came slowly, quietly, wrapped in ordinary days that demanded patience and humility. Ireti no longer measured her life by what she owned, but by what she could do with her hands and how she showed up each morning. She woke before sunrise, prepared herself in silence, and stepped into the day with a calm she had never known before. She worked on farms, bent under the sun, her back aching as she weeded rows of crops that did not belong to her. She washed clothes at the river, her fingers wrinkled and sore by evening. She helped older women carry water and firewood, not because she expected praise, but because she understood now what it meant to be seen and ignored in moments of need. Some days were harder than others. There were nights when hunger gnawed sharply, when her stomach growled so loudly she wondered if Ao could hear it. There were moments when old fear crept back, whispering that this fragile balance could shatter at any time. But each time that fear rose, she looked at Ao and reminded herself that survival did not always come from what we hoard, but from who stands with us. Ao continued to grow stronger, both in body and spirit. She learned to help wherever she could, fetching water, running small errands, listening attentively when elders spoke. She asked questions about everything, about farming, about village customs, about Ireti's past. At first, Ireti answered cautiously, choosing her words carefully. But over time, she found herself opening up, sharing pieces of her story she had never spoken aloud. She told Ao about her mother, about the hunger, about the promises that vanished, about the fear that had followed her like a shadow into adulthood. Ao listened quietly, her eyes filled with understanding beyond her years. "You were protecting yourself," Ao said gently when Ireti finished. "You just didn't know how else to do it." Those words brought unexpected comfort. Ireti had spent so long judging herself harshly that compassion felt foreign. But slowly, she began to forgive herself. Not all at once, not easily, but enough to breathe a little easier. The village, too, continued to shift. Trust returned gradually, like grass growing after fire. People invited Ireti to sit with them. They asked her opinions. They shared food without expectation. And in return, Ireti shared what she could: time, effort, kindness. She never promised more than she could give, and she never closed her door again. One afternoon, the village head summoned her. Ireti approached his compound with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She had never been called there before except for formal matters. Ao waited outside, nervous. The village head studied her quietly before speaking. "You lost much," he said. "But you did not leave. You did not turn bitter. That is not easy." Ireti lowered her eyes respectfully. "We have discussed among the elders," he continued. "There is land near the eastern path. Small, but fertile. It has been unused for years. We are offering it to you to farm." Ireti's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. "Why?" she asked honestly. "Because you are no longer living only for yourself," he replied. "And because we have seen your effort." She accepted the land with trembling hands. When she told Ao, the girl's eyes shone with excitement. "We can grow our own food," she said eagerly. The farming was hard. The land was stubborn. The rains were unpredictable, but each seed planted felt like a promise rather than a gamble. They worked together, learning through mistakes, celebrating small victories. When the first shoots broke through the soil, Ireti felt a joy she had never known when she counted her stored grains. The harvest was modest, but it was theirs, and Ireti shared it, not recklessly, not out of fear, but willingly, with intention. She gave some to neighbors who had helped her. She kept enough for herself and Ao. For the first time in her life, she understood balance. One evening, as they sat eating under the open sky, Ao asked a question that made Ireti pause. "What will happen to me?" she asked quietly. Ireti looked at her, heart tightening. "What do you mean?" "I mean, will I always stay with you?" Ao asked. "Or will I have to leave someday?" The question carried more weight than it seemed. Ireti thought carefully before answering. "You are not a burden," she said. "You are family. If you want to stay, this is your home." Ao smiled, tears filling her eyes. She leaned against Ireti, resting her head on her shoulder. In that moment, Ireti felt a sense of completeness she had never found in possessions. Years passed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. Ireti grew older. Ao grew taller, wiser, stronger. The land flourished with care. The village remembered the story of the stingy woman who lost everything, not with mockery, but with respect. Her story became a lesson told to children and adults alike. That clinging too tightly can leave you empty. That fear can make you cruel. That loss can open doors fear never could. And that sometimes, losing everything is the only way to finally find what truly matters. The woman who once guarded her door with iron chains now left it open. Not because she had nothing left to lose, but because she had learned what was worth holding onto.